In today's lecture, we're going to be discussing compositional formulas and pictorial organizational tools and strategies for you to learn. We're going to be essentially going through a list of 16 different types of compositional formulas. These are pretty major, and we're going to look and review a series of artworks that really demonstrate these particular formulas quite well. So our first formula is going to be the cross or T composition. This is often seen not only in historical works, but works that are contemporaneous to us. As we can see here, the figure of Christ is in an X-type position or a T-type position as he lays on the ground. His foot is coming forward to the viewer, and he is primarily laid in this position. And his value, his physical skin value, the whiteness of his skin, is really a direct line for guiding us through the most important elements of this particular work. So once again, this is going to come back and pull us back into thinking about line as a directional tool and as a guiding device to help us think about how we should approach and view the image. Now, this is once again a natural type of inclination. We always follow lines as human beings. That's the way our mind is psychologically programmed and trained. So use this as a way to direct the viewer through the composition, such as using value or the line of a body to suggest how we should enter into a composition, where we should look, or where we should be directed. So also thinking about value in addition to this can also help complement this idea even further. Another great artist, for example, is Ben Grasso's work. He's a contemporary artist. He often uses T or X type compositions. Once again, he's simultaneously using contrast of value and both line work to help guide us through these compositions. X and T compositions are very dynamic in the way they function because they activate all four quadrants of the canvas and or the pictorial frame. As you can see on the left work, a black kind of shrubbery or garland with Christmas lights is really actively stretching from the bottom left all the way to the top hand right. And we've got some really beautiful lighter values that are poking through, activating the top left to the bottom right. So this is a very active, very movement-filled composition, and it's really held together primarily with the strong X composition that is being placed with both the line and contrasting values in the painting. Over on the right-hand side, we can see a strong composition of a T structure. Once again, this is a similar ideology. It's breaking down the frame of the painting into four quadrants. He's activating the paint in such an active way, not only with just value contrast, but also with color theory and color unity, but also with an active line that is really kind of static, or it's really kind of dynamic and moving us through the image. So that kind of formal breaking it down and dividing the plane is also an interesting way to handle and approach composition balance. We also will move on to the L composition. This is a work by Pablo Picasso. This is one of his Rose periods. This happened right after the Blue period. So if any of you are familiar with his work, that's where we can kind of place this in history. We can see this primarily by the way he's placing figures and the relationship of color theory that he is using. Primarily, we see a large figure with a large red kind of suit on in the background, a pink tutu, and then that's mirrored with this red, or rather matched with this red skirt on the bottom right-hand side. This presents a kind of natural L position just by grouping these like objects. Since that like color is unified and also is a similar color and value, we are naturally going to collect those things or put those things together optically and mentally in our minds. We also see the strong dark value here that is contrasted by the lighter figure who is also looking off to the right-hand side of the image. So this is also talking about how our eyes are psychologically trained to focus in on a human face, and particularly the eyes. Eyes are a great guiding tool. Most of the figures in this particular work are either looking over to the right-hand side or looking down somewhat. So there's creating a strong L element through this particular composition. This is a very successful way to strategize and balance an image. We can also see blue being represented here as well. This is more of a triangular structure that's being presented, but mostly we have a really strong L format just because of the cluster of the figures, the height of the figures on the left-hand side, and then the shorter figure sitting on the ground on the right-hand side. Another strong L composition. This is loaded up with L's. We can see this in the tapestry being presented on the far back wall of the right-hand side of the canvas. There's an L here, there's an L here, there's an L here. We can also see the strong contrast of white value of the washed wall in the background. That is also presenting us with a nice strong L composition. If we look at the table and the lines that are being directed from the curtain to the table to the chair, it is all directing us in a strong L composition. Most of our main figure and attention is going to be pulled into the bottom right-hand side of the corner where Vermeer is actually painting the figure. So once again, talking about a directional line and a directional shape to guide us through the composition. L compositions are a strong composition as well as playing with the psychology of how we read an image. We can also think about this in terms of the letter L and how, as Westerners, we associate reading from left to right. So this is a strong composition for a lot of Western societies or Western languages. So this could be a good option for you as well. Here is another type of L composition, though this one is in reverse. So we can see over here we have a strong dark valued tree, and then a large active field of both darker green values and very vibrant saturated light yellow values that are pushing forward onto the left side of the canvas and off. So this is a really strong reverse L composition. This is a very active image in terms of its beautiful, lush, vivid marks and texture, such as demonstrated wonderfully by Van Gogh. So we can really see that activation of line, but also how the line is directing us. That texture is also a directional tool to move us through the image and the way it's placed. Also look at values here as well, strong contrast as well as a strong unity of color form and color temperature that really do some wonderful things just compositionally guiding us through the image. Our next kind of compositional strategy is triangular compositions. Triangular compositions are historically very strong compositions. This is a dynamic, primarily that's mostly psychological. They play in a lot of power structures or symbolic structures, such as the pyramids, and we can see pyramids appearing not only in Giza, but as well as a variety of other different mosques, temples, and religious iconography throughout human history. So the pyramid structure, the triangular structure, whatever you want to call that term, is a power structure. It has significance, especially in human culture throughout time. So once again, this is a strong and very important way to think about how to unify a composition. This thing is riddled and loaded with compositional triangles. We can see it here from the way the directional lines happen in the figures themselves on both the left and right side of the bottom of the painting. We can see the extension from the line here moving up to the leg and thigh, moving down all the way to the foot being a triangle forming here, a triangle forming here, ultimately a triangle forming a major, large triangle clustering this group of women together. Same here, another natural triangle being pulled down, both simultaneously with dark and light values, also a directional line linking us up and bringing us back down, another triangle, as it guides us through. And once again, an overall triangle for the cluster of female figures on the right. Then we have a large archway of triangles that is grouping and primarily acting as types of bookends to consolidate or to hold all of the information in the canvas for us. If we go into the background, there's another triangular figure of the figures in the back. As well as the buildings and some of the tree structures. So in terms of just how this thing is built compositionally, we can really break down a large mass of triangles and then find smaller works of triangles being depicted in this scene. Here is another great example of a compositional formula of a triangle format. This one's a little bit more complex. It's not as obvious as our wonderful Cezanne painting, but we can see how this particular work, the Rise of Christ, with Gauguin or with Rubens' work, excuse me, how we can really see line being directed through value. So large triangular structure here, a triangular structure here with darker values, and then this is quite obviously a large structural triangle being pulled from the Christ himself on the crucifix, with the line of the rope being pulled upwards by this man on the right hand side. A large kind of mass of people hosting or hoisting up Christ's figure along with the crucifix is really creating a very strong lighter value contrast between that darker value background, enforcing that overall triangular format. We can also see triangles popping up in a variety of other different places through the figures themselves. Also on the side panels of this triptych image, we can see other triangles being presented. In general, there's kind of a bookend type of composition for this triptych as well, but it is also triangular. So this, once again, is a type of symbolic power structure. So if you're looking for a really dynamite way to symbolically reference historical uses of the triangle in compositions, whether that relate to denotions of power, such as the church's role in developing society, or whether that is more theoretical uses of a triangle and power structures in general, this could be a really great strategy for you to organize composition. Here's another great example of a triangular structure in a little bit more symbolic and a little bit more subtle ways. And this gets us back into that conversation talking about eyesight. Humans are naturally drawn to eyes and faces. That eye is that window into the soul, right? So here we have a lovely kind of conversation going on between this wonderful Norman Rockwell painting, where we have the runaway, which is this little boy, and we have the power or authoritative figure of the police officer sitting on the left, and the nice gentleman that is serving food behind. We can see a dynamic power structure as well as a triangular structure happening between the eyes. So this becomes a really dynamic image, even though it is quite simplistic in its form, but it really hits you over the head with the meaning and the interpretations that you can take away from this. It's charming and quaint, but yet it is really strong in terms of compositional development and how it's staging its conversation in a really simple but potent way. Steelyard compositions. Often one of the more difficult ways to think about composition. This can really be exemplified in Claude Monet's haystack series and paintings. Claude Monet made a variety of haystack paintings throughout his career, but there was a series of when he was living in the south of France, and he would go through massive amounts of paintings and canvases, just capturing the light and how it affected these haystacks. In a sense, this is kind of where we start with Steelyard compositions. It's a classical kind of balancing scale, which really talks about equal weighting, and you can almost think about it like a weighted measurement kind of scale, and how we're balancing those things out. So this is almost like a seesaw type of thing, and we're also kind of balancing how these forms work with color and light and value, in particular with this work. We do have a really heavy object that's sitting in the front of our composition that is much more saturated and more warm. Now we have a smaller, darker object that is cooler sitting behind it, but then that's off-casted by a really hot value, really, really warm color that's much lighter in value as well on the top right. So there's this balancing act that's happening between the color, between the value, and between the temperature. So this becomes a really well-balanced image, primarily just because it's balancing those three factors. So whenever you're playing with Steelyard compositions, you're really playing with technical development of perceptual and optical weighting. So this is where those understandings of formal balance strategies in terms of how you organize line, how you organize value weight, how you organize scale of an object to another object, and then how you organize color or saturation or warmth or value, or warmth and tone. So warmth and coolness, right? So thinking about this could be a really, really wonderful way to introduce some balance scale types of strategies into your work, where you think about that kind of range and placement of balance and measurement in your composition. Here's another great example of the steelyard composition. Once again, we're going to look at the same kind of ideology. If we look at our larger figure on the right-hand side, that's being balanced out by a little bit more saturated colors on the left-hand side, as well as some of the lighter colors below it. So once again, this is thinking about that optical weighting of mass, thinking about it in terms of value, color temperature, and then color saturation. Okay, so that's a good example of it as well. This is another great example of a very dynamic balance scale that's happening here. So this is not only dealing with all of those issues that we just brought up, but it's also dividing the page in a really drastic way. So as we can see here, this right-hand side of the image, the bottom right-hand side of the image, is much more detailed. It's accurate in terms of we can see the structure of the faces. We can see details about the characters. There's color differences. There's a lot of warm, saturated tones. We can also see a lot of movement happening on the bottom right. Now, when we move conversely over to the top left, even though this is a much darker value in some ways and is all very saturated with this blue color, the detail is less in the figures, right? They're more silhouettes operating in the distance. This is also harshly divided with an angle here, but yet it feels quite balanced. And this is a real master of composition that we can see developing here with how the artist is choosing to negate information, and that is kind of the big difference between the value. It's not only just the color temperature itself between the cool background and the warm foreground, but it's also the information that is more detailed in the foreground that's really jumping forward for us. So there's multiple ways to think about optical weighting and this balance scale strategy that can be taken and really multiplied and manipulated in a variety of different ways. So another great composition is the U composition. Historically, I think we see U compositions a lot more in landscapes, primarily just because peaks and valleys, I think, are something that naturally appear. But this is a great way to organize a space or organize a landscape itself. And that's situating it essentially between two columns, or thinking about this almost as like bookends. So we've got a large kind of section down here, the ground itself, the foreground, the middle ground, the background, right? And it's dark, it's got a lot of texture, detail, there's warm tones and cool tones, very active space. And then in the distance, we have these kind of cool mountain structures that are popping up, creating a great U that has a nice center emptiness, but with all of this activity closer to us as the viewer, as well as being framed in this wonderful kind of bookend situation. So U compositions can be really active and dynamic, and they often create a tremendous amount of space. Particularly if we look at this one, we have this kind of back and forth as we're kind of slingshotting all the way back into the foreground. So there's a tremendous amount of depth that's being able to be created just because of the compositional strategy that this particular artist wanted to choose. Hill's work in particular, I think, is really demonstrated of 19th century fine oil painting of landscapes and discovering the great American West. So it's really exemplative of the great sublime, or that kind of unopened or big open questions that loom in when we're exploring topics that deal with the sublime. So this could also be an explorative kind of composition that you start to use when you start to question issues that deal with the sublime, or large spaces or vast territories. And you can take that kind of as you will. All right, the symmetrical composition. So we've talked about in the past symmetry as well as asymmetrical balance strategies and the differences between them, things that you can do with them, and the way we can start approaching them or thinking about them in terms of a compositional strategy. But symmetry often is equated with, dealing with topics that are of spiritual natures, or creating a really balanced situation, whether that might be a critique on it, or whether that might be to enhance a property of perfection or beauty or whatever. So this could be a really complicated and also a really beautiful way to metaphorically gesture to something that needs to be challenged or questioned, or a way to amplify a certain type of space that has some interesting depth to it, right? To amplify that beauty in some ways. So for this, we have a spiritual painting here, right? This is a Jan van Eyck painting during the Northern Renaissance. And this is a really kind of lovely painting in so many ways because we have not only balance in terms of value, but in color, but it really is also balanced too from the kind of altar position that it's made in, right? This is an altar piece. So these hinges here, these doors close, and this is the main kind of centerpiece. Then you open it up, and of course, this is what is revealed inside. This epic, beautiful, highly detailed, and highly attention-based symmetrical composition of an altarpiece. So we have kind of the Christ figure in the center, right? We have disciples, and we have this kind of religious iconography all loaded into this image. We also can see, the symbolic reference of Christ being referenced in the Lamb, but also how these figures are being organized into clusters of symmetrical circles throughout the composition. We can see symmetrical circles presented on all of these frames here, and as well as that symmetrical circle being indicative of that kind of crown and golden jewel, if you will, that halo almost indicative of some of these frames of the actual composition. We see Adam and Eve also being presented facing each other, and as you can see, all of these figures are tilted towards the center. So there's another type of symmetrical balance also within the positioning of the figures themselves that provide equilibrium and provide a sense of balance and direction for our eyes to view. So it's not only symmetrical in terms of its uses of overall patterns or shapes like circles, but the colors that bounce back and forth and are united and provide a consistent application and form of color, but also too the positions of the bodies are all representative of a directional inwardness that goes towards our Christ figures, okay? Composition once again, a smoke painting here. So we can see this really beautiful smoke painting, that painting residue of smoke itself. And this is really just quite lovely. As we can see, it's a symmetrical form. Compositions are naturally symmetrical, and thus they provide an element of beauty and conclusion in some ways because there's some predictability to them. So there's this kind of need for this beautiful, complete object. So compositions are really quite aesthetically pleasing in many ways just because it is quite round, it has a predictable pattern, and it's quite satisfying to view. Here is an circular painting by this wonderful active kind of process of creating this mechanism which holds fireworks, and then it's lit, and then it is moved around the canvas or drawing paper. So that's what actually creates some of these marks zipping around, creating this beautiful composition. Here is another example of an composition. This is a history of rise and fall. So this is a contemporary work that really talks about China, in particular, its building upon culture, as well as an examination of culture and capitalism as it's developed in the 21st century. So we can really see this large mass of information built upon the landscape, and it is just piled high, but yet there's an overall structure of an O here. This kind of centralized introspection really kind of challenges as well as brings up really sophisticated questions of the role of religion, society, and culture, and how that's developing in China and how that's evolving in the 20th century. This is also formally being compared to a white background. So this once again pops off the page formally. So thinking about compositions is not just a way to get away with a symmetrically balanced image, but it's also a way to critically question something. You can think about how the circle has evolved in Western culture as well as Eastern culture. So this is also an interesting topic that we can start diving into. And we start to adapt shapes to organize our composition. That can be used as a type of metaphorical reference to dive into content, to make your image more sophisticated, and to allow the viewer in a psychological way that can also help to advance their kind of study of the work, as well as provide more content for investigating the work. Three-spot composition. This is very similar to a kind of balance scale kind of strategy in some ways. You can think about this too as a foreground, middle ground, and background type of strategy, which I think sometimes too balance scales can lend themselves to study of that space as well. But this talks about like kind of rules of three. And once again, this talks also kind of about a triangular structure. We're going to group objects that are like, meaning that if an object is similar to each other in terms of shape, in terms of color, we're going to naturally want to group those objects together. So the three-spot composition really talks about grouping objects of likeness, but it also talks too about symbolically attaching or directing lines together, creating a triangular structure. So a rule of three is kind of a natural strategy for us. It's also a psychological strategy, and this could be something too you investigate in your compositions in the future. The overlapping shapes composition. Artist Julie Moretu tends to be a master of this, but this is where you take really dynamic, very active kind of compositions, and you start to overlap shapes and overlap information. Some think this could be a way to organize chaos in a greater or lesser way. So if you're dealing with a lot of information or a lot of data, this could be a way to think about how you start to symbolically stack that information up, and notice how the line is really our directional tool here. There is color balancing happening quite a bit in terms of warm colors and cool colors balancing each other out and how they kind of move us back and forth through the image, but also look at the directional line. Everything is moving towards the center space. So this is a complicated strategy, but if done well, it can be very successful for organizing complicated information or systems themselves. Overlapping shape compositions can also be used in the graphic design world, and I think often are most utilized for graphic design and more promotional kind of applications. So let's look at these forms here. We have some New York and London and Sydney, Tokyo kind of landscapes that are using bright, fun, active colors with simple silhouettes of the cityscape stacked on top of one another. This is not only playing with color theory, but simple aesthetics of simplifying design and making things interesting and pulling on those landmarks for those spaces. It's clean, it's minimal, but yet it is really powerful in its application. We also have some really nice posters here that talk about diversity and form. We can see how human figures are very different here in terms of color, in terms of value, in terms of shape. But yet they're layered in such a way that they feel unified and balanced because of the color theory and the shape similarity. Okay, so overlapping compositions or shapes can also be a way to simplify form, but also create unity as well. Diagonal compositions. Diagonal compositions use directional lines and break up the form into quadrants in a different type of way. So this is a good example of how maybe a merger between a T and an X composition can start to unite in more of a sophisticated or more of a active way. So we can look at Marcel Duchamp's New Descending Staircase, how we have directional lines that are quite active through the space. And all of this directionality really activate the image, activate the line, activate the value, and create a semblance of movement. And we do get the sense that there is a figure, and that figure is drastically moving down a staircase. So this is a really effective strategy for not only creating movement in a work, but also creating a dynamic locomotive or locomotion in work, if you will. Pattern compositions. So Andreas Gursky is a famous photographer of the 21st century, and he often employs this strategy in many of his works. As we can see, the colors themselves are quite active and dynamic. They pop, they're loud, but the one unifying factor here is that kind of commodity of these bars or square shapes, as well as the 99 cents. So we can see 99 cents presented here throughout the entire image, as well as those kind of rectangular square shapes being presented in the shelves and the lining of the shelves. So you can also think not only about forms kind of being duplicated, but we can also think about symbolic gestures, letters, or numbers being that pattern that starts to recognize or be unanimous or consistent throughout the image. This can be a heck of a way to really describe consumption or commodity, as well to really push home a concept in a really powerful, meaningful way. Pattern compositions can also be found in a lot of graphic design work as well. Here are some simple examples of calendars. We see the pattern being very clear. There's definitely a style to all three of these. They are unique, but yet they have this harmony between them. And that's primarily because they're choosing a color strategy. They're using a replication of pattern and form that is throughout and consistent throughout the image. Here we see a white, gray, and red color theme. And we can see overlapping forms of both opaque and transparent, a severe kind of editing in some ways or minimalization happening with actual images that are being grayed out. So this whole entire calendar theme is quite beautiful in its representation as well as consistent in its design theme. On the far right-hand side, we have a very kind of modern design, but all of the weekdays are blocked out in black bold font letters that are sans serif, and we have gray weekend days. So we have a very consistent unilateral approach of clean design that's harmonious and functional. The S-shape composition, one of the most famous in terms of landscape photography and painting. We can see a large S for the waterway being created in this composition by Ansel Adams. This is a directional line, and once again we're going to turn our attention to thinking about contrast in an image and also talking about line being a guiding tool to help us work through an image or to guide our eye through a space. So think about this when you start guiding us through an image. What's the main point here? How are you going to organize this content to be aesthetically pleasing, but also directive or indicative of a mood, a feeling, or the meaning of the overall image? Here's another painting. This is a landscape painting. As you can see, we have a nice brook that starts out on the top or the bottom left, and it guides us all the way through the image, revealing a large sea or bay area in the center of the image. So it's really quite open. We can also see a variety of other types of design or composition strategies being employed here as well, such as a U composition. So you can also think about too intermixing some of these compositional strategies as a tool to navigate multiple areas or to make an image more sophisticated. As I said, this is a beautiful example of an S composition just because of that waterway as it zigzags back and forth through the image. S compositions are really great for this. It really forces the viewer to explore the painting or explore that two-dimensional work in an active way and a robust way. And it's also a good way to use line as a directional tool to hit up on certain points of the image. But also, like I mentioned before, think about combining some of these strategies to make your particular work more strong or to think about it in a different way as well. Let's see, radial perspective line compositions. So radial compositions really focus on lines and going back to one central point. So Aslam Kiefer's work here is a really active space. There is grit to these canvases. Usually they stick off about 5 to 6 inches sometimes from the canvas, and there's cement and ash and paint and concrete and bits and pieces of objects actually embedded into the work itself. So these active territories really are texture-ridden and heavy, massive works. They're also just huge in scale. They are physically take up a lot of room on a gallery wall. So if we look at this particular painting, how do we start to organize that information? And often he will use radial lines or perspective lines to help structure content, to help organize the chaos. And adding linear perspective to a work will add that kind of order, will add that kind of necessary pattern recognition or semblance of order to a work. So think about using radial lines or perspective lines as a way to guide viewers through the canvas, to give them some type of logical order of operations. Here's another great example of radial lines or perspective line compositions. So once again, this is all going back to a one-point perspective. The School of Athens, we can see our wonderful philosophers discussing critical things, critical thinking and critical theories. But we can also see how these lines are directing our view into the most important subjects, right, as they debate their philosophy. So this is also a way to start suggesting or implying where the most important content is in the viewer, for the viewer. This not only can be a way to organize an image, once again, providing that substance of stability and recognition and familiarity to a space, but also provide context on where the viewer should look. Dynamic compositions or static compositions are kind of newer in some senses. This is a Jackson Pollock, and I think a really great example of a dynamic composition. This, of course, is an action painting, so a little bit more challenging to kind of introduce students into initially, meaning that we don't necessarily think about this as a door or a window into a world, but rather the action of the mark, his mark in particular, how he made this and dripped this onto the canvas, is a way to follow and navigate through the space. So in some ways, this is a very abstract painting, and it's a painting about process and hand making something, and to a greater or lesser extent. So this type of style painting is like a newer approach, I guess you could say, in the larger context of art, that is. But it's also a very dynamic, active way to explore an image. In this painting, you're not rather looking into a window into a world or a universe, but rather you're exploring the hand of the artist. You're following his active marks. At some point in time, he was dripping this paint. He was moving us around this image. And you're following in his footsteps through the journey of this painting, through this recording of his actions. So that's a way we can think about this kind of dynamic composition. It's a much more conceptual way to view art, but also it's very beautiful and very active. The rule of thirds, or the tic-tac-toe, as I like to call it sometimes. So this is often used in photography. Essentially, it's a grid where we divide our pictorial frame into 9 zones. And in those 9 zones, we have bars. So where these bars meet, that is usually where the content or the subject sits within the frame. This organizational strategy relies primarily on this kind of grid system, and that really helps organize an image conceptually as well as formally. We can see this often employed, like I said, through cinema, through film, through photography. Here's an example from The Office. Here's Jim. We can see him classically staged right here on those main connection points where our grid lines intersect. We can also see this, however, in paintings as well. We have a nice grid line appearing here, also a grid line appearing here, on the ballet teacher himself, and also on the ballerinas. So there's really nice implied lines that can be broken down into images that you can start using. And when I say lines, I mean the lines of the overall forms of the ballet dancers, the head or hair of the ballet dancers, the main form of the ballet instructor sitting on the right side, or the figure in the foreground closest to us on the left side with her tall figure, her very long bow around her neck going all the way up that is extenuated by a column. So looking at these lines, looking at the relationship and connection between objects or forms in an image, really will start helping us figure out how we're going to balance an image, how to view an image, and ultimately give you a tool and a strategy to compose the content in your images. Here's another great example of a golden ratio, and this is going to get us into our last and final compositional formula. It is a very dynamic kind of composition, and it's a very mathematical composition formula. So this is David LaChapelle. He's a great, wonderful photographer, but he uses the golden ratio. And sometimes we can think about the rule of thirds and the golden ratio being very similar. Essentially, the way the golden ratio works is it's a rule of phi, which is a mathematical formula. And essentially, it works with a type of square, a square, and then another rectangle. And this type of formula will then repeat into infinity. So you can maximize this as large as you want, or you can minimize this as small as you want. But this formula, when applied, will equal itself. And so this type of structure, we can also think about the golden spiral. That is what this form is called, and will equal, or it will hit on these consecuting or converging points of where the two squares and rectangle fit, creates a really nice natural pattern. We can see this pattern in hurricanes, from spiral images above, from shells, from ears, and a variety of other plants and natural organic information that can be seen just in nature. And so it's a really compelling image, essentially, for us to view, because it's not only natural, but it's also a form that we are used to recognizing and seeing. Some people like to talk about the golden ratio as a more organic and a more aesthetically pleasing version of the rule of thirds. And like I said, there is a mathematical formula to it, but essentially the general rule is thinking about one square being large, a smaller square, and then a rectangle that fits between those two, and how this formula can then be repeated into infinity if desired. Here's the formula itself. And here is a good example of how this can be manipulated out or manipulated into infinity. I've also got some helpful links too if you want to learn more about the golden ratio and all of that wonderful stuff. Here's an example from Salvador Dali. I think this is a really great example for how to use the golden ratio. As we can see here, there is a golden spiral perfectly developed between Christ and some of the spiritual figures around the table, as well as above. We can see, if we break this down, we can see a triangle, not a triangle, but two squares and our rectangular form presented throughout the image. So it's a really kind of beautiful, organic, but yet very symbolic compositional formula that really is quite aesthetically pleasing, as well as psychologically appealing to human minds. And here's an example too of just some natural ways that we see this in our everyday life. And this is one of those things too where it's a compositional strategy that's embedded in our human psychology. Once again, we see ears all the time, we see shells, right? And this structure, like I said, appears in nature in a variety of different ways. So it's a very compelling and very aesthetically pleasing and satisfying compositional strategy to approach. We can also see it also in Athens. Here's a breakdown of how the golden spiral and the golden ratio can be broken down into the wonderful Salvador Dali's Sacrament of the Last Supper. Here is the overall square, as we can see this being divided. We can also see the tabletop being the rectangle start and the smaller square on those areas. Here's another great example of the golden ratio. This one is literally almost verbatim. Seurat was really obsessed with the golden ratio, and there's many works, especially during his circus series, where he did quite a bit of golden ratio paintings. We can quite literally see a square within a square and then a rectangle, okay? We can also see this broken down into smaller structures as well. If you really go into this thing, it's really quite amazing how well he was able to perform this golden ratio. So that's going to pretty much conclude our compositional strategy lecture. I've got some other great links listed in the video, so I'll make sure to attach this PDF to the YouTube video, so you can simply click on the Google Doc and go through this PowerPoint if you choose, and click on some of those links to learn more about some of the topics and paintings we discussed. Hopefully you've enjoyed and learned something extra and new about composition. I hope you do use these strategies in your own work and really review and think about how critically strategy compositions like this can really improve your overall compositions, as well as conceptually and formally resolve your work.